The year was 1857, and the land itself seemed cursed by heat, the kind of heat that did not simply scorch skin, but gnawed at the inside of a man, wrapped around lungs, filled mouths with the taste of metal, and turned the air into a slow, invisible fire. The sun blazed above the Morton plantation in Georgia, burning every blade of grass to straw and every dream to dust. Nothing truly lived here. Everything merely endured. The horizon shimmered in waves of heat so violent, it bent the shape of the world. Every breath tasted of iron and smoke. Every sound carried the same weary rhythm. Machetes cutting cane, the crack of whips, the muffled prayers of people doing all they could to remain human. If this story moves you already, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more untold histories, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your voice keeps these forgotten stories alive. No one remembered the land before it belonged to Elias Morton, though some of the elders said there had once been forests here, tall pines and magnolias that shaded rivers instead of these endless rows of cane. Morton's father had burned those trees to the root when he seized the property, clearing space for the wealth he believed God owed him. Elias inherited both the ash and the arrogance. The fields spread endlessly, acres of sugarcane swaying under the weight of despair. From sunrise to moonrise, men and women labored until their souls felt smaller than the shadows they cast. The work was relentless, grinding bodies down to bone, breaking spirits before they could harden into rebellion. The overseers rode between the rows on horseback, whips dangling lazily at their sides like tame serpents, waiting for permission to strike. Among the men working that summer was Isaac, an old enslaved man whose spine carried as many stories as scars. He had been brought here long before Elias inherited the place. He had seen 3 masters die and 3 sons grow crueler than their fathers. Age had folded his shoulders inward, yet there was something unbroken about the way he moved, measured, deliberate, each swing of his blade precise. The younger men followed his pace without even meaning to. He never raised his voice, but around him silence carried weight. His hands were calloused, dark, strong, moving with a rhythm learned through decades of survival. Every motion was quiet rebellion, steady, careful, deliberate. He had built his own kind of resistance by outlasting them, but though his body survived, his spirit carried wounds older than memory. Each lash throughout the years had marked not just his skin, but the invisible map of his endurance. From the veranda at sunrise, Elias Morton watched the field come alive. He was 35, tall, with hair so blonde the sunlight seemed to pass through it. To those who did not know him, his posture could be mistaken for nobility. To those who did, it was simply pride dressed in linen. A silver flask hung from his belt, glinting each time he shifted. In the rising light, he might have been mistaken for a man surveying a kingdom instead of a prison. High up on the hill, the whitewashed mansion stood like a crown built from bones, its beauty mocking the ruin surrounding it, a structure that feasted on misery. Morton walked through it like a king of ashes, a man who mistook fear for power. He had been raised among men who called tyranny tradition, who taught him cruelty as discipline, and he wore that heritage with pride. The master's eyes, sharp and cold as the steel of his cane, followed Isaac's every motion. He often wondered why the old man never begged, never flinched like the others. It irritated him. Fear and pain were languages he understood, but Isaac spoke neither. To Morton, the sight below was not suffering but empire, a symphony in which every grunt, every cry, and every drop of blood played in time with his wealth. He was young by the standards of masters, yet old in wickedness. The son of men who taught him that a whip was holy and ownership divine. At dawn, the bell clanged from the overseer's post, splitting the silence above the sweltering fog. The enslaved stepped from their barracks in torn garments, heads down, tools slung over tired shoulders. Isaac led no one, yet the others watched him. Years had made him quiet, but there was something in his silence that spoke louder than rebellion, a presence, a kind of dignity that could not be whipped away. Isaac kept his distance from Morton, not out of cowardice, but because he understood that survival required silence. To move unseen, to listen more than speak, was its own kind of resistance. Each night, when others whispered stories of escape, Isaac listened but said nothing. Escape was a dream he no longer permitted himself. Instead, he dreamt of something else, something darker, quieter, justice that didn't come from men, but from whatever force still remembered his pain when no one else did. The work began before the mist had lifted. The sound of machetes slicing through the cane became the heartbeat of the plantation. Sweat slicked dark skin, dropping into the cracked earth that had long stopped giving anything back. Isaac's rhythm was steady, his breath shallow, timed with the rise and fall of his blade. He no longer thought of escape, for there was nowhere left to run. His imagination had buried freedom years ago. The only freedom left now was in how he carried pain. By noon, the fields shimmered with heat haze. Overseers rode horseback between the rows, their presence a constant reminder that pain was only ever a moment away. Morton approached on foot, the hem of his waistcoat brushing the cane leaves. His boots crunched dry earth stained with calloused footprints. There came a day when the air itself felt strange. The sun burned hotter, the slaves' breaths rougher, as though the sky had turned against them too. Elias Morton stood near the well, laughing with a bottle of whiskey in hand, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. He called to Isaac in that mock-gentle tone he used before humiliation. He stopped where Isaac worked, studying the old man with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to owning flesh. "Old man," Morton called, voice sick with mock sweetness, "you move slower each day. I could swear you're trying to wait death out." Isaac looked up, squinting under the brightness, not meeting his eyes directly, but letting his gaze linger halfway, enough to show awareness, not defiance. "The sun's heavy today, master," he murmured, voice cracked and low. His voice was calm, unbroken, like the surface of still water. Morton's smile thinned into irritation. "Heavy, is it? You think the sun works for you? My father used to say the sun belongs to those born above the dirt, not in it." He stepped closer, placing a boot deliberately upon a patch of cane Isaac had just harvested. "You people forget that sometimes. You think endurance gives you worth." Morton sneered. "The heat? You think the heat excuses laziness? My father would have flayed a man for less." The laughter from nearby overseers flickered like a cruel flame. Isaac turned back to the field. His hands were trembling, though not from fear. It was exhaustion, the kind that pressed down on the soul more than the body. Isaac said nothing. He lowered his head again, and for Morton, that silence was fresh insult. He wanted noise, pleading, submission. Sound that proved power still mattered. The midday hour arrived, and with it the punishment. Morton wasn't content with words. In his drunken cruelty, he demanded humiliation, not as correction, but as spectacle. When the overseer slowed his horse nearby, Morton seized the whip from his hand. Perhaps the sun needs help reminding him of his place. The field turned soundless, but for the wind. Isaac was pulled to the center of the field, where everyone could see. The whip cracked across Isaac's back once, then again, a sound that ripped through the stillness, sharp as breaking bone. The crack of the whip sliced the heavy air, finding old wounds and opening them anew. The air stank of sweat and iron. Isaac's body trembled, but he neither screamed nor fell. Yet Isaac did not scream. He swallowed every sound, every tremor of agony, because the scream would belong to Morton, not to him. The silence stretched with each strike until even Morton felt it grow heavy around him. The onlookers watched in torn silence. Among them, a young woman named Naomi wept quietly, her tears mixing with the dust on her cheeks. She had lost a brother to Morton's violence years before, and now she watched Isaac, her closest thing to family, bleed and sway but refuse to kneel. That refusal was dangerous, holy even, in a world built on obedience. Finally, exhausted from his own fury, the master stopped. His eyes were wide, gleaming with something close to fear, but buried quickly beneath pride. When the whipping ended, Morton stood over him, chest heaving, eyes glassy with intoxication and pride. He leaned close, breathing sour whiskey. "Now," he hissed, "thank me for your lesson. That's what you do when a man teaches you your lesson." Blood slid slowly across Isaac's side. Isaac lifted his head slowly. Blood traced down his back and sides, shining like molten iron in the sun. A faint smile, almost invisible, crossed his lips. He lifted his head just enough that his gaze met his master's shoe, not his face. "One day, master," he whispered, "you'll bow lower than I ever did. You'll thank me." Morton froze. The words slid through the air like smoke through fire. Laughter erupted from Morton and the overseers, but a chill coiled through those who heard him. There was something in the old man's tone, something that didn't sound like anger, but certainty. Then he laughed, and the sound spread to the overseers, thin and hollow, echoing against cane and sky. That night, Isaac's wounds burned as he lay in the slave quarters. The old man lay on his side, his back a map of open wounds. Naomi, the young woman who nursed him, tried to clean the cuts, humming softly. The melody, older than either of them, tried to clean each mark while humming an old melody born long before either of them. Her voice trembled. "You shouldn't have spoken," she said through tears, whispering. Isaac looked at her, the lines of her face blurred by candlelight. His eyes stayed shut. "He's afraid," he said softly. "That's why he laughs. A man like him feels safety only when others suffer. But fear stalks him too. He just doesn't see it yet. He doesn't fear the strong. He fears the ones who survive what's meant to kill them." The candle flickered. Lightning flashed far away. The storm never reached them, but thunder rolled just enough to shake the rafters. Outside, a storm gathered. The trees groaned under wind and lightning cracked the sky open for a heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a sound that slithered through the night like a warning. Naomi dipped her cloth in stale water, pressing against the bleeding lines. Her fingers trembled as she asked, "What did you mean when you said he'd thank you?" Isaac's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Even masters bow in time. Every man returns to the dirt." Over the next days, Isaac grew weaker. The lashes had cut deep, and infection began to whisper inside his flesh. Days passed. The world carried on, but the fields had changed. The wind sang differently through the cane, a low drone that followed Morton wherever he walked. The old man's words clung to him, repeating in his mind like the hum of gnats at dusk. Still he worked. Morton refused to let him rest, determined to break the old man completely. The others begged him to stay down, but Isaac refused. "I'll finish my work," he muttered, "before the earth finishes me." When Sunday came, and the plantation gathered near the well for their ration of water, Elias Morton stood tall before them, nursing a hangover and a bruised ego. He watched Isaac leaning slightly on his cane knife, sweat streaking dust across his face. There was something unspoken passing between them, a quiet endurance stronger than humiliation itself. "Bring him forward," Morton ordered suddenly. The overseers paused. "Master, you heard me." They dragged Isaac by the arm to the well's edge. The entire field watched. Morton's face darkened with a cruel delight. "For this man thinks he's greater than his station," Morton said, raising his voice for all to hear. "Let his lesson be remembered." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of coins, and let them fall into the dust at Isaac's feet. "Pick it up," he commanded. Isaac did not move. The crowd fell deathly silent. "Pick it up." "I have no use for your silver," Isaac said finally. Morton's jaw clenched. His hand twitched toward the whip at his belt, but something about the old man's eyes stopped him. They held no hate, no fear, no defeat, only patience. Morton turned sharply. "Enough! Get him out of my sight!" By the 7th day, he could no longer stand. The fever gripped him hard, and even Morton noticed the strange quiet that had settled across the plantation. The fields seemed stiller, the sky oddly dim. Naomi stayed beside Isaac through the night, his skin burning under her trembling hands. He called for her once, voice a hoarse whisper. "When I go," he said, "don't cry. Just listen. You'll hear me in the wind. The ones who took will give back." Naomi frowned through her tears. "Don't talk like that." But Isaac's eyes were far away now, seeing something beyond her, something vast and dark. Before dawn broke, his breath stilled. Naomi wept into the cold space beside him, her sobs the only sound in the still barracks. When they buried him, in a shallow grave beyond the sugarcane rows, the sky turned a sick hue of red and grey, as though the earth itself was uneasy. Quietly, with no prayer aloud, the ground seemed to sigh. Elias Morton didn't attend the burial. He sat on his porch with a glass of brandy, laughing at a crude joke one of his guests made about the stubborn slave who forgot how to die quick. Watched from afar with arms crossed over his chest, face unreadable. "Good," he muttered. "Let the earth have him. Maybe it'll feed again now." That night, though, something changed in the air of the estate. The laughter faded strangely early. The cicadas fell silent. Dogs whimpered without reason. Thunder rolled again, closer than before. Morton woke abruptly near midnight, not from sound but from the suffocating stillness that pressed against his chest. A low whisper brushed through the room. It wasn't a word yet, more like breath carried from far beyond the walls. He cursed under his breath and sat up, scanning the room drenched in moonlight. Nothing moved, but when he looked toward the window, his stomach clenched, because what he saw wasn't outside. It was a faint outline reflected in the glass, the shape of a man standing right behind him. He spun fast, heart pounding. The room was empty. Morton laughed at himself, rubbing his face, muttering that whiskey makes ghosts of lamplight. But when he lay back down, sleep refused to come. Every creak in the wood grew louder, every shadow lengthened as if watching, but this time the storm would not pass. And Elias Morton would never sleep the same again. By dawn, Morton had dark circles beneath his eyes, and a temper sharper than his whip. He ordered the field hands out early, desperate to occupy his thoughts with the rhythmic punishment of labor. Yet throughout the day his commands came more erratic, his fury quickening with every hour. He shouted at the slaves to move faster, to stop whispering, though no one was whispering. The overseers exchanged uneasy looks. Something in their master's composure was cracking. That evening, while crossing the fields, Morton paused at the well, the same spot where he'd mocked Isaac. A crow perched on the post, staring at him with uncanny stillness. He kicked a stone at it, but the bird didn't move. Instead, it let out a sound that strangely resembled human laughter before flapping away into the reddening sky. Elias Morton's breath turned shallow. "Nonsense," he muttered, shaking his head. "Wine and guilt, poison for the mind." But as night fell again, he found himself unable to escape the sensation that the air itself was watching him. The laughter he once threw so easily into the world now seemed to echo back from unseen places. The same laugh turned hollow and cruel. In the dark quiet of his room, the floorboards began to whisper. And when he knelt to listen closer, thinking it must be rats or wind, he heard a voice, faint, ragged, cold. "Still think the heat's heavy, master?" Morton stumbled backward, knocking over the candle. The flame guttered out, leaving him in darkness thick enough to taste. By the second night after Isaac's burial, the Morton estate had gone strangely quiet. The fields, which once murmured with the constant hum of insects and the rustle of cane, now stood hushed, their stillness thick enough to hear one's own heartbeat break the silence. Even the slaves whispered less. Their songs, those soft, steady hymns that rose at dusk, had ceased. No one could explain why, only that it began after Isaac died beneath that crooked tree by the far fence. The cicadas had vanished from the trees, and even the river nearby flowed slow and cloudy as if watching. The plantation looked hollow, fields stripped bare, fences canted, windows dark. Nothing truly moved except wind shivering through the cane, whispering too softly for sense. Elias Morton refused to speak of the man again. The very mention of Isaac's name met a hard glare, or the sharp crack of his cane on the nearest surface. "Don't carry a dead man's ghost into my house," he snapped once at his wife, though she had said nothing. His fury raged like the summer storms, loud, brief, unreasoning. Inside, the mansion itself felt altered. The servants noticed it first. Candles that would not stay lit, mirrors that fogged without heat, doors that drifted open despite no wind. In the great hallway hung portraits of Morton's ancestors, men with powdered wigs and tight smiles who had built their fortunes on blood. One morning, the butler swore the oldest portrait, of Elias's grandfather, had shifted its gaze overnight, now staring off toward the window that faced the slave quarters. Morton laughed when he heard it, but his laughter lacked conviction. That night, he ordered the painting covered with cloth. Inside the mansion, Elias Morton sat in the main hall, his boots caked with dried mud that reached halfway up his legs. He hadn't changed his clothes in days. His skin burned with fever, eyes bleached of color. The servants kept distance when passing him. They said he talked to things that weren't there, but it wasn't only him who had changed. The house now smelled of earth, damp, raw soil, so strong that Clara had taken to burning herbs just to breathe. Sleep remained a rare mercy. Morton drank himself toward it, chasing oblivion with whiskey's burn. He was drinking earlier now. Whiskey before breakfast, bourbon before noon. He told himself it helped steady the nerves that had begun to betray him in subtle tremors of the hand. He told himself he didn't dream, though the damp stains on his sheets told otherwise. Yet, when his head fell heavy, the dreams rose vivid. Isaac standing knee-deep in cane, the wind pulling at the old man's torn shirt, while his mouth moved soundlessly. In the dream, Morton wanted to step closer, wanted to hear the words, but each time the earth turned soft beneath his feet, sucking him downward until only his screams reached the storming sky. He woke each morning drenched in sweat, fingernails muddy as if he had clawed the dream itself. Days passed like that, fevered waking, sleepless nights, fury growing. The overseers tried jokes to lighten his mood, but laughter seemed to bruise his ears now. Every sound irritated him. The shuffling of feet, the rustle of dresses, even the clink of porcelain at breakfast set his teeth on edge. Whenever he closed his eyes, something pulled at him. A murmur from beneath his feet. Words felt rather than heard. At first it came only at night, but by the fourth day the whisper had followed him into daylight. He was standing near the well when he heard it, just above the wind, breath curling inside his ear. A single word, bow. He turned at once, but there was nobody near. The nearest worker was yards away, bent over a low patch of cane. Morton's grin faltered. "Speak again," he muttered, And when no answer came, he laughed. A loud, awkward bark toward nothing. The laughter of a man who needed the sound to drown doubt. He spat into the dirt. "This land eats softness. You hear me?" The wind stilled. For the first time in his life, Elias Morton realized what silence could weigh. Then the well water turned foul. It began with a strange taste, metallic, sour. Within days it darkened, reflecting not blue sky, but a murky hue like blood diluted in clay. The enslaved drew buckets from it and crossed themselves in secrecy, refusing to drink, despite hunger's pull. Morton insisted it was rot from some dead animal below the surface, and sent 2 men to clean it. They lowered ropes, held torches over the black mouth of the well, and stepped back screaming. When they hauled the rope up again, a swarm of flies burst out, thick and wet, their droning filling the courtyard like a swarm from hell. Morton's temper exploded. "You superstitious fools!" he shouted, crushing a fly on his own arm, though his skin crawled beneath it. "You see rot and call it curses. Maybe you all need another taste of discipline." That night, he ordered another public punishment. No crime named, no explanation given. He claimed the workers had grown too slow since Isaac died. "Laziness spreads like plague," he told his overseers. "Beat it out before it infects the rest." Beneath torchlight, 2 men were stripped and lashed while the rest looked on. But even Morton could feel the mood around him shift. The usual fear in their eyes was still there, yet something else had joined it. Something colder, older, like the earth itself bearing witness. The wind picked up midway through the whipping, howling through the cane until the torches bent sideways and sparks danced across the ground. One spark caught a clump of hay. In seconds, flame raced along the fence. Someone shouted. Others ran for water. Within moments they were fighting fire in the dark, while Morton cursed, his voice nearly drowned by wind. The flames did not spread wildly. Instead, they moved cunningly, curling in circles as though tracing words across the soil. By dawn, the fire had died without destroying a single crop. In the ash lay strange markings, loops and curves burned into the ground. Morton kicked at the ashes with his boot. "It's nonsense," he muttered, though his pulse thudded like drums behind his ears. Coincidence. The overseer beside him crossed himself when he thought the master wasn't looking. That noon, Naomi crept to Isaac's grave. She had done so each day, kneeling to clear away the leaves that gathered over the mound. None of the others dared join her. The earth there was always damp even when the rest of the ground baked dry. The air smelled of iron and rain. She closed her eyes and murmured the old prayer Isaac had taught her, a call for justice that travelled not upward, but downward into the soil. "May the hands that bled here guide the roots," she whispered. "May the ones who took tremble when they walk." She didn't know Morton stood far off, watching her. His boots crushed the wet leaves as he approached. Naomi jumped when she heard him. "You come to worship?" he asked, voice thick with liquor. "It's only a prayer, massa." "Prayer?" He spat into the dirt. "You think words can change the order of things? That old man you cry for, he's gone, dirt now, and the dirt's mine." He ground the heel of his boot over the burial mound until wet soil smeared his soul. "Remember that." Naomi's hands clenched. For a brief, wild instant she imagined striking him, imagined his surprise, but fear held her still. She lowered her gaze. "Yes, massa." Morton waited for a sign of defiance. Seeing none, he turned and strode off. What he did not notice was the faint tremor beneath his feet, as if the ground exhaled. By evening, his dogs refused to follow him. The hounds that once tore after runaways with savage joy now whined and backed away whenever he approached. He kicked at them, shouting until his voice cracked, but they only fled farther from him. That night, his wife, Clara Morton, woke screaming. She claimed something had touched her ankle under the sheets, cold, rough, like a hand rising from mud. Morton dismissed her terror with scorn, for though his own skin crawled, remembering the sound she'd made, a choked sob that had not sounded human. He ordered all lamps kept burning through the night. The house glowed like a beacon of fear amid the darkness, but light could not chase away what came after. The third night held a storm. Lightning split the sky without rain, striking near the barn and making the earth tremble. In its blue flash, Morton saw shapes moving through the field, figures bent beneath invisible weight, like workers still tending to crops. Yet all his slaves were locked inside their quarters for safety. He staggered to the porch, heart hammering. When the next flash came, the shapes were closer, silhouettes of people trudging slowly, heads bowed, hands bound by shadow rope. Their outlines glowed faintly, as if formed from ash and moonlight, and leading them, taller than the rest, was a figure with shoulders slumped but proud, a limp in its left leg, Isaac. The breath froze in Morton's lungs. He blinked, and the figures faded back into the storm's darkness. But from the fields rolled a deep vibration, not unlike the rhythm of hundreds of feet stomping in unison. It shook the porch boards. The horses in the stable reared and screamed. Then came the smell. Wet iron, sweat, and something older. Something that reeked of history itself. Morton retreated into the house, bolting the door. He poured another glass of whiskey, but his hands shook too violently to hold it steady. "Madness," he whispered to no one. "I am going mad." Clara approached quietly, a shawl clutched around her. "Maybe the Lord's trying to tell you something," she said. Morton turned on her with a glare that seemed to shine from a furnace behind his eyes. "The Lord minds heaven. I mind this land." Yet even as he said it, thunder rolled directly above, so loud it rattled the chandeliers. Sleep mocked him again. When dawn crawled over the horizon, the workers found strange footprints in front of the mansion steps, bare, wide, pressed deep as if by tremendous weight. They led from the porch out toward the field, then vanished halfway along the row where Isaac had collapsed days before. Word spread in hushed tones. Morton punished anyone caught speaking of it, though whispers multiplied like roots underground. Some said Isaac's soul had risen to wander the cane rows until the master begged forgiveness. Others claimed the soil itself had become conscious, bearing Isaac's memory like a seed. By the 5th day, illness swept the plantation. Livestock grew thin. Milk soured overnight. Morton's horse refused to eat and snapped its stall gate open with wild strength, galloping straight into the woods until its whinnies vanished. One overseer fell sick with fever, delirious and raving about hearing singing outside his door, soft voices chanting words he couldn't understand. He died before sunrise. Morton buried him without ceremony. Yet he could no longer shake the smell that clung to his own hands afterward, the smell of the graveyard mud, sour and metallic, the same scent from the night Isaac had died. Then came the maggots. They appeared first in the master's pantry, white threads wriggling inside sealed barrels of flour. Within hours they spread to the larder, to the walls, to the corners of his study. Servants gagged as they scraped them away by the shovelful. When Morton shouted for the overseers to clean it, they found the creatures had arranged themselves into patterns, crude but unmistakable letters scrawled in moving white. The word they spelled was simple, terrifying: bow. Morton smashed the nearest barrel until the letters collapsed into pulp. His mind whirled between disbelief and loathing, yet the command followed him like echo. He drank harder, his voice roughened, his eyes turned wild. At times he claimed he heard Isaac breathing near his ear whenever he closed his eyes. "You wanted thanks," he muttered once at the empty air. "You'll not have it." He smashed a mirror, scattering shards across the floor. For a moment he thought the broken glass reflected not one figure but two, his own and Isaac's behind him. Outside, Naomi felt the shift in the wind. The soil near Isaac's grave had begun to pulse faintly at night, damp though no rain fell. She and a few others gathered there after dark, whispering prayers with trembling voices. The ground warmed beneath their palms. One of the men swore he heard faint words inside the earth itself, a chant, slow and rhythmic, saying only one phrase over and over: "He remembers." Morning came colorless, a grey dawn without music. The cicadas had vanished from the trees, and even the river nearby flowed slow and cloudy as if watching. The Morton plantation looked hollow, fields stripped bare, fences canted, windows dark. Nothing truly moved except wind shivering through the cane, whispering too softly for sense. Inside the mansion, Elias Morton sat in the main hall, his boots caked with dried mud that reached halfway up his legs. He hadn't changed his clothes in days. His skin burned with fever, eyes bleached of color. The servants kept distance when passing him. They said he talked to things that weren't there. But it wasn't only him who had changed. The house now smelled of earth, damp, raw soil, so strong that Clara had taken to burning herbs just to breathe. That day he ordered everyone into the front yard. The survivors gathered unsure and silent, watching him stagger down the steps with a bottle in one hand and the other hidden behind his coat. The air felt thicker, warm but heavy, as though pressing inward from every side. Elias stopped before them. His face was a ruin of sleeplessness and drink. "You think I'm mad?" he said. "Maybe I am, but the ground's gone sour since you buried that thing. You feel it too." Nobody replied. His gaze flicked toward the crooked tree far out in the field, a dark smear against the pale sky. "We'll dig him out," he continued, lowering his voice into a growl. "If the earth wants him so badly, she can have him deeper, where no breath reaches. Maybe then she'll stop crawling at my door." Clara stepped forward, horrified. "Elias, please, that's blasphemy. Let him rest." He turned and struck her full across the face. The sound cracked like a gunshot, echoing down the empty yard. "Rest? There's no rest for filth. Not for him, not for me, not for any of you, until the land obeys again." He started marching toward the field. The men followed at a distance, some from fear, some from the dim hope that seeing the master destroy himself might free them somehow. The ground near the grave was still misshapen, refusing to lie flat. Morton set the bottle down and sank his shovel deep. Clay clung to each thrust like oil, heavier than before. "Dig!" he shouted. "Dig until I can spit in his face once more." When the others hesitated, he raised his whip. "Do it, or join him under it." The first shovel blades hit stone, but the sound was wrong, soft instead of sharp, the dull thud of something pulsing. The men froze. Morton pushed them aside and reached into the hole himself. His hand vanished almost to the elbow in cold muck. A tremor passed through the dirt, slow, rhythmic, like a living creature taking breath. For one stunned moment, he thought he felt a heartbeat. Then the ground exhaled. A gust of fetid air burst upward, thick with rot and sweetness. It slammed into his face, knocking him backward. He gagged, wiping at his mouth. "You bastard!" he gasped. "You dare!" His words broke as the men fled screaming, stumbling through cane that no longer stood still. The stalks rustled back and forth, though no wind blew, brushing against each other in steady rhythm, almost like applause. By the time Morton reached the mansion again, the sun had bled out behind a wall of storm clouds. He barred the doors and shutters himself, dragging furniture to strengthen them as thunder rolled overhead. Clara stayed upstairs praying. Naomi and 2 workers huddled beside the kitchen stove, every flame blown out though they'd tried 3 times to relight it. The air refused fire. Before midnight, Clara crept down to find him still in the hall, staring at the floor. His boots were off. Mud smeared his bare feet, dark and wet. "Elias?" she whispered. He didn't glance away from whatever he studied. "It moves when I'm still," he murmured. She knelt closer. "What moves?" "The floor." He turned finally. His voice was small. "He's under there. I hear him. Scraping." She swallowed her cry. "You need rest. You need light." He laughed softly. "Light just shows you what's already coming." He reached out then, catching her wrist with his black-stained hand. The mark had spread to his neck now, thin lines veining upward beneath the skin. "He's patient," he said, "waiting for me to bend." His fingers dug tighter. "But I'll never bow, not to God, not to ghost, not to dirt." Clara twisted free and backed toward the stairs, trembling. "You're frightening me." "Good," he said simply, turning again toward the floor. That night, the first board split. The sound was faint, like nails easing loose, but it carried through the house. Naomi heard it from the quarters and thought at first it was thunder again. Then came another, closer, wood sighing open, grain by grain. By dawn, cracks ran from the threshold to the hearth, thin dark lines filled with fine red dust. At breakfast none could eat. Clara's lips moved in constant prayer. Morton stood at the window, watching fog creep off the fields like smoke. The dog that had survived now whimpered at the door, claws scraping to get out. When he ignored it, it began to growl, low, strange, a sound that rose until it stuttered into something not natural at all, like laughter caught in an animal's throat. The beast fell silent an instant later. Morton opened the door to find it lying still. Its throat was clean, unmarked. Only its eyes stared upward, wide with terror. He kicked the body aside and slammed the door again, breathing heavily. By evening, he had given up pretending. He walked the halls barefoot, speaking to the air. "You were right," he murmured. "The ground remembers." He laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Then remember this." He raised his pistol and fired once into the ceiling. Plaster rained down. "I killed you, myself. There's memory for you." Outside, the rain started. It didn't fall from above. It seemed to rise from the ground, fog turning liquid, coating the cane tips with slow droplets that slid backward into the earth. Clara watched through the upstairs window, clutching her crucifix. Below, her husband walked out into it, arms open like a man greeting salvation. "Isaac," he shouted, "you want me to beg? Here I am. Come take it from my mouth." The rain thickened quickly, a sheet that blurred the world to grey. Through it she saw him kneel mid-field. The gesture looked almost willful at first, his knees sinking into mud, arms raised high, but the motion turned stiff. He tried to stand, failed. Bubbles formed around his legs where the ground swallowed them slowly. She pressed her fists to the glass, screaming his name. He heard her dimly, voice distorted by wind. He tried again to pull free, and the earth held him fast. He bent forward against it, sinking to his hands as though forced into prayer. At last, with one hoarse cry, he stopped fighting. A shiver passed across the field, a tremor that travelled outward until even the trees shuddered their leaves in answer. The lightning above froze everything white. For a blink, his outline burned against that brightness, head lowered, spine bowed. Then, there was nothing left but the hollow impression of a man pressed into mud. The rain ended an instant later. The plantation stood silent for hours. When dawn came again, the sky opened clean. No trace of Elias Morton remained. No body, no hat, not even his cane. Only a shallow pool reflected the bright cold light. Around it grew a fringe of small white flowers that hadn't been there the day before. Naomi would find them first, stooping low to touch their petals. The ground breathed faintly under her hand, warm despite the morning chill. She looked toward the house where Clara sat motionless at the window and whispered, "He's gone." A breeze stirred through the cane, carrying with it the faintest murmur. At first she thought it her own imagination, but then she heard it clearly, the voice that had once belonged to Isaac, calm and final as truth itself. "Bow low, master." The sound rippled outward through the field, settling over every stalk. For a long time no one moved, and somewhere deep under the soil, the earth seemed to sigh, satisfied at last. That night the house smelled of damp soil again. Morton followed the scent through the halls until he reached his study. The floor was wet, slick with dark mud emerging from between the boards. He stared, jaw slack, as the mud shifted, bubbling slowly until something pale pushed through, a hand. Word of Elias Morton's disappearance spread quickly. Some claimed he'd been swallowed by the swamp. Others whispered he'd gone mad and fled into the night. But those who lived near the plantation knew better. They heard the stories from the survivors, the slaves who stayed long enough to bury what remained and then vanished into the woods. They spoke of a master who mocked a dying man and paid for it with his soul. They spoke of a field that breathed, a well that whispered, and a tree beneath which no grass would grow. Within months, the plantation was abandoned. Clara fled to her family in Charleston, never speaking of what she'd seen. The remaining workers scattered, some north, some west, carrying with them the tale of Isaac and the land that remembered. The mansion stood empty, windows shattered, doors hanging loose. Vines crept through the foundation. Animals avoided it. Even the crows that once circled overhead now veered away, their cries turning to silence as they passed. Travelers began to report strange occurrences. Horses refused to cross the property line. Compasses spun wild. At night, faint lights appeared in the distance, flickering candles that moved through the rows as if carried by invisible hands. Some swore they heard singing, low voices rising in unison. The sound of labor turned to hymn, and on nights when the moon hung full and heavy, shadows appeared in the field, bent figures moving in rhythm, their tools striking the earth in time with a heartbeat only the ground could feel. Years passed, and the stories deepened. A preacher came once to cleanse the land, but his voice failed him before the first prayer ended. A surveyor tried to map the property, but his instruments shattered. A buyer from the north visited with plans to rebuild, but he left before sunset, pale and silent, refusing to explain what he'd seen. The land resisted every attempt to reclaim it, as if it had chosen solitude over servitude. By the turn of the century, the Morton estate had become legend. Parents warned children to stay away. Old men spoke of it in taverns, their voices dropping low. The story changed with each telling, but the core remained, a master who broke a man and a man who broke the earth's patience. Some said Isaac's ghost still walked the rows, whip scars glowing faint in moonlight. Others claimed the soil itself had become his body, every grain a piece of memory that would never fade. Naomi lived long enough to see freedom come, though she never returned to the plantation. In her final years, she told the story to anyone who would listen, not as a ghost tale, but as a warning. "The ground listens," she would say, eyes distant. "It hears every drop of blood, every tear, every prayer whispered into the dirt, and when it's had enough, it answers." She died in 1889, surrounded by grandchildren who had never known chains. Her last words were a song, the same melody she had hummed over Isaac's grave all those years ago, and as her voice faded, those present swore they felt a tremor pass through the floor, faint but sure, as if the earth itself had paused to listen. Decades later, when developers finally raised what remained of the mansion, they found something strange beneath the foundation. The soil there was black, dense, and impossibly warm. When they dug deeper, the ground began to hum, a low vibration that made their tools shake and their ears ring. One worker claimed he heard a voice rising from the dirt, repeating a single phrase over and over. He refused to speak it aloud, but that night he quit and never returned. The land was left alone after that. No one built there, no one farmed it. The crooked tree stood for another 50 years before lightning finally split it in two. But even in death, the tree refused to fall. Its roots held firm, twisting deeper into the earth as if anchored by something more than wood. Today, the Morton plantation exists only in records and whispers. The fields have long since returned to wilderness, but on certain nights when the wind blows just right, travelers passing by still hear it, a low murmur rising from the earth, steady and patient, the sound of a voice that never forgot. And if you listen closely, you can hear what it says: "Bow low, master, bow low." If this story reached into your soul, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more forgotten histories that deserve to be remembered, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your voice keeps these stories alive. When the sun rose on the Morton estate the next morning, it did so without warmth. Light washed across the fields like pale water over stone, revealing land changed in ways no one could quite describe. The cane stood crooked and dull, its green turned soot dark. Birds avoided the horizon entirely. The air hummed, low and steady, a note you could feel more than hear. It was as if the earth itself had found a new rhythm, the slow, deliberate pulse of something that did not sleep. Clara Morton sat in her bedroom, staring at the unused half of the bed. The sheets bore 2 indentations, one still damp with mud despite her washing it hours earlier. She had opened all the windows to drive out the stench of soil that clung to everything, but the odor only deepened, seeping from the walls as though the house exhaled grave breath. Her hands trembled as she clutched her Bible, lips moving through prayers she could barely remember. Each verse felt hollow, the words turning to ash in her mouth before they could reach heaven. Downstairs, the remaining servants drifted like ghosts through rooms that no longer felt theirs. They avoided the parlor altogether. The floorboards there bulged slightly upward, soft underfoot, and warm to the touch. Naomi alone entered it daily, leaving offerings of herbs, bits of bread, and candle stubs. She did not pray for forgiveness, only balance. "Master's gone to account for his deeds," she whispered one dawn while laying flowers taken from the pool where he vanished. But sin don't wash easy from soil like this. The petals darkened instantly, collapsing as if burned. She pulled her hand back, feeling the warmth beneath the boards pulse once, twice, then settle into stillness. The house creaked around her, timbers sighing like ribs expanding with breath. She crossed herself and left quickly, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the thick air. By week's end, the plantation gained a new silence, not absence but presence. At night, soft creaks traveled through the mansion in loops, tracing the path Elias used to walk during his midnight pacing. Sometimes Clara thought she heard his pulse in the walls, a faint, steady throb running behind the wood. Servants who slept near the kitchens swore they heard footsteps in the hall between 3 and 4 in the morning, always stopping before the door that led to the back porch. One girl claimed she saw a shadow pass beneath the crack of her door, bare feet leaving wet prints that faded as quickly as they appeared. One evening, Naomi dared step outside under a bruised red sunset. The air vibrated faintly with distant thunder. Behind her, the great house loomed, shutters half torn, windows black. She found Clara kneeling near the fence line, rosary slipping through trembling fingers. "You ought to come away from there, mistress," Naomi said softly. Clara's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "He's not gone," she murmured. "I feel him watching, a punishment for sharing his pride." Naomi hesitated, then knelt beside her. "Maybe he watches, yes, but not to hurt you." Clara's voice cracked. "Then why does his voice say my name whenever I try to pray?" The wind shifted. Between the stalks of cane, both women heard it. A low murmur like breath pushed through teeth. The syllables scattered, but one word clung clear: bow, rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind. They ran inside. For the next 3 nights, no one left the quarters after dark. People packed what they could, warning each other that whatever haunted the plantation cared little whom it found. Yet when the first wagon attempted to leave, the path collapsed beneath its wheels. The mules screamed and bolted. No one tried again. Soon, hunger carved itself into their faces. The cane rotted. The well water smelled of iron. Babies wailed through the nights, mothers rocking them with words that offered no comfort. Amid this ruin, the only steady figure was Naomi. She stopped sleeping altogether, spending her nights at the window facing the crooked tree, humming the song Isaac had loved. Some said they saw a faint figure standing near that tree when she did, a tall shadow with its head bowed and hands open. On the 10th night after Elias's disappearance, thunder struck directly above the mansion. The blast shook plaster from the ceiling, scattering dust across sleeping bodies. Clara screamed, convinced the roof had given way, but when the servants gathered torches and looked upward, they saw that the storm had passed already. The air was calm again, calm and wrong. A few dared follow Clara into the upstairs corridor. There, long streaks of mud stained the walls, rising from floor to mid-height, as if someone had dragged filthy hands along them while moving unsteadily forward. Prince led straight to her bedroom and stopped at the side of the bed. The mark of bare feet lingered on the boards, drying even as they watched. Clara collapsed beside them, whispering her husband's name over and over until her voice dissolved. When Naomi reached her, she saw the impression stamped into the sheet, the same shape of a man's knee pressed deep into the fabric, the same position he had sunk into before the land swallowed him. From that night, Clara was never the same. Each morning she woke crying out for forgiveness, begging for rain where none came. Each evening she drifted through the halls calling to Isaac instead of Elias. The servants avoided her, too afraid to correct the mistake. Her eyes grew hollow, her skin pale as the walls around her. She ate nothing, drank only water that tasted of rust. By the end of the second week, she could no longer stand without help. The house decayed around them. Vines crept through foundation cracks. Termites ate the support beams. One morning, the mirror in the dining hall shattered without touch. Every shard reflected not the room, but open soil, black earth stretching endlessly in all directions. The servants swept it away quickly, refusing to look too closely at what the glass had shown. When Clara finally died, she did so sitting upright in a chair facing the window, eyes fixed on the far field. Her lips had dried into the shape of a single word, Bo. Naomi found her at dawn, still warm but lifeless, one hand extended toward the glass, as if reaching for something only she could see. They buried her beside the fence, far from the crooked tree. Though Naomi suspected distance meant nothing anymore, the ground had claimed them all. Years passed. The war began, swept through the south and ended. New flags rose and fell, each promising freedom, each leaving scars of its own. No soldiers stayed long near the old Morton estate. The locals said the ground hummed under their tents, that horses balked and refused to drink from its stream. After one patrol disappeared entirely, men stopped visiting. The land was marked on maps with a simple notation, uninhabitable. Decades later, explorers found the mansion reduced to ribs of timber jutting from wild grass. Inside, a single patch of floor still shone unrotted in the parlor, the same place where Morton once knelt and cursed. Nothing would grow on it. Around that spot, the floorboards bent in slow waves as if breathing. One man tried to pry up a board and found the wood hot to the touch, almost feverish. When he leaned closer, he heard a sound, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried deep. He left immediately and never returned. People began to tell stories that on nights when lightning crawled sideways across the clouds, you could see the shadow of a man standing in the doorway, his head bowed so low it brushed the frame, that below the crooked tree, the dirt sometimes cracked open and released the scent of whiskey and blood, that a woman's hum drifted through the valley carrying a slave's name. Naomi lived to see none of it. In her old age, she left the land at last, walking barefoot north until the horizon swallowed her. Before leaving, she carved one line into the tree trunk, words she hoped the wind itself would remember. He made the earth his servant, and the earth remembered. Generations later, children still dared one another to touch that carving after dusk. Some claimed to feel the bark tremble beneath their palms, warm and alive. Others whispered that the ground there was never still, that even in the driest summer, if you pressed an ear to the soil, you could hear faint breathing underneath. A few swore they heard voices, not one but many, rising in a chant that had no words but carried the weight of centuries. Every story agreed on one truth. The curse of Elias Morton was not vengeance alone, it was memory. The land had learned from those who bled on it, and once the earth knows hunger for justice, it never starves again. In 1903, a developer from New York arrived with plans to rebuild. He dismissed the stories as superstition, calling them ignorant folklore meant to scare away progress. He brought engineers, surveyors, and a crew of 30 men. They camped on the property for 3 days. On the 4th morning, the developer was found kneeling in the field, shirt torn, hands black with soil. He was muttering to himself, eyes wide and unseeing. When they asked him what happened, He could only repeat one phrase: "He's still here, he's still waiting." The crew left that afternoon. The developer never spoke of it again, but those who knew him said he aged 20 years in 3 days. His hair turned white, his hands shook constantly, and he refused to touch dirt for the rest of his life. By the 1920s, the Morton estate had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking proof of the unseen. Spiritualists came with candles and incantations. Historians arrived with cameras and notebooks, all left with more questions than answers. Photographs taken on the property developed strangely. Images blurred, faces appearing in the background where no one had stood, shadows bending against the light in impossible ways. One photograph, taken near the crooked tree, showed a figure standing among the cane, tall, lean, head bowed. The photographer swore no one had been there when he took the shot. When the image was enlarged, the figure's face became clearer, an old man with deep scars across his back, eyes looking directly at the camera. The photographer burned the negative and never returned. Through all the years, the land remained untouched. Grass grew tall, roots claimed the ruins, and the crooked tree stood silent vigil over the place where Isaac had been laid to rest. The pool where Morton vanished never dried, even in the worst droughts. Its water stayed cold and clear, reflecting only sky, never the faces of those who looked into it. And still, on certain nights when the wind blows just right and the moon hangs low, travelers passing by hear it. A sound rising from the earth itself, steady and patient, the voice of a man who refused to be forgotten. "Bow low, master, bow low." Years rolled over the Morton land like tides over bones. The mansion finally collapsed after a storm in 1892, its walls folding inward with a groan loud enough for nearby farmers to hear 10 miles off. What used to be manicured gardens became wilderness again, oak roots breaking through the marble pathway, moss sealing the last cracked stones of the porch. The well where slaves once drew water was now a hollow throat filled with stagnant rain. Locals called the place Dead Row, and no one built there again. By then, talk of the curse had spread past county borders. Travelers heading south avoided the old plantation road. Wagon drivers claimed their horses froze mid-stride as they neared the crooked tree. More than one swore they saw a faint light near the ruins, sometimes an ember-red glow, sometimes a single candle floating without flame. Those who ignored the warnings returned feverish, or not at all. Some came back silent, eyes distant, refusing to speak of what they'd seen. Others never came back. In 1903, a preacher from Atlanta came to challenge the superstition. He was young, educated, dismissive of what he called dark inheritance. Locals watched him stride through the high grass in a suit far too fine for the road. He reached the remains before dusk, raised his Bible, and read verses into the empty air. But as night fell, even his voice faltered. He felt it first beneath his boots, the faint shifting of the ground, slow and patient, like breath drawn in by a sleeping giant. His candle guttered, though the wind was still. He told the story later, pale and trembling, that something whispered from the dirt, one single word that stopped his prayers cold: bow. He left before morning, and never returned to that county again. His congregation noticed the change in him, how he flinched at the sound of wind through trees, how he refused to walk barefoot even in his own home. He died 3 years later, still relatively young, murmuring in his fever about hands reaching up from beneath floorboards. After that, the county sheriff ordered the road barred. He claimed it was for public safety, yet everyone knew fear had lived in the Morton bones too long to be walled out. Still, each generation found one soul drawn back there, a boy daring his courage, a wanderer seeking ruins to plunder. They all returned changed, silent people who kept glancing down, as though expecting the ground to open at any step. Then, in the summer of 1921, the land stirred again. Rain had not come in months. Dust storms wrapped the hills, turning noon skies the color of rust. In one nearby settlement, a man named Joseph lived on a small rented patch that bordered Dead Row. He had never seen the mansion it once held. For him, the legend was an old whisper, a warning his grandmother repeated like lullaby. He was only 30 and believed in work, not omens. When drought cracked his own field, he crossed the boundary one evening, desperate to draw water from the ancient well. The path was easy to find, 2 long furrows still marking where wagons had rolled a lifetime earlier. The crooked tree still stood on the rise, split but alive, leaning over the emptiness like a bone against the sky. Joseph carried a rusted bucket and a coil of rope. Sweat soaked his shirt, though the air was cooler here. Each step seemed to echo beneath him, as though the ground were hollow. He reached the well and peered down. The circle of water far below gleamed faintly silver, almost luminescent in the fading light. He tied the rope and lowered the bucket, listening for the splash. It came, a sound too deep, too slow, resonating like a drum struck in a cathedral. When he pulled, the line caught, not heavy, not light, but resisting in pulses. He tugged again, cursing under his breath. The rope jerked once, hard enough to cut his palm, then loosened. He dragged it up quickly. The bucket returned half full of water, so clear it gleamed blue-white, and inside it, resting neatly at the bottom, lay a coin. He frowned. Old silver, worn thin, the face barely visible. Instinct told him to throw it away, but thirst won. He lifted the bucket, drank deeply, and wiped his mouth. The water was colder than any he'd tasted, almost sweet, with a faint metallic aftertaste that lingered on his tongue. Yet even as he swallowed, a chill pressed through him, crawling into his chest like winter air through a broken door. That night, he dreamed of the field before it rotted, the rose lit with gold, the air heavy with the chant of hundreds swinging blades in perfect rhythm. At the top of the hill stood a man with a whip, and behind the man, another shadow, darker and taller, bending the sunlight itself. The whip cracked once. The shadow leaned forward and whispered through Joseph's skull, "Tell them we still work." He woke gasping, mouth full of the taste of soil. His hands were black to the wrists, though he'd washed them before bed. The stain wouldn't come off. He scrubbed until his skin bled, but the darkness remained, seeping into the lines of his palms like ink into paper. In the weeks that followed, his luck twisted. Tools rusted overnight. His mule bit him without provocation, then died 3 days later. When villagers came to haul the carcass, they stopped short. The ground around it had turned black, pulsing faintly as if breathing. Joseph tried prayer, salt, fire, none changed anything. The stain on his hands spread to his forearms, creeping upward like vines beneath his skin. At last he returned to the well with a lantern and the empty bucket, determined to confront whatever curse he'd drawn from the depths. No moon shone that night, only the whitish haze of stars. He approached the tree slowly, aware of the hum beneath his feet. The air smelled again of metal and rain that never fell. He called out, half in anger, half in fear, "If your curse is real, speak. Why torment those who had no part?" The wind answered from the cane field, long dead but swaying now as though alive. The stalks brushed one another, forming a sound like the low murmur of a crowd, repeating words in time. The rhythm built, soft thuds, like hoe blades meeting earth, like hearts beating in unison. Joseph dropped to his knees. The words came clear, rising from the soil itself, carried on breath that smelled of turned earth and blood. "We work, you rest, we remember." The light of his lantern wavered, from the well-spilled mist, crawling across the ground until it reached his hands. Within that haze, something glimmered, a figure slowly forming, bent but strong, head lowered yet towering above him. The face was the color of soil, shadow carving every line of pain into dignity. Scars crossed the bare back, each one a story written in flesh. When it spoke, the weight of centuries pressed through its breath. "You drank from what never forgot," the voice said, deep and patient. "Now you'll carry the memory." Joseph tried to stand, but his body refused. He felt the chill crawling upward through his veins, turning his blood cold. His limbs stiffened. "Please," the voice sighed, not with cruelty, but with something close to sorrow. Not punishment, only remembrance. The figure's outline began to scatter like ash on wind, dispersing into the mist that had birthed it. "Tell them the ground still listens." When neighbors found him the next morning, he was lying beside the well, alive but unmoving. His eyes stared wide open, pupils dilated as though reflecting storms no one else could see. He lived another 3 days, repeating the same phrase each hour, his voice growing fainter with each repetition. "The field breathes." After his burial, strange blossoms sprouted where he'd lain, white flowers identical to those that had appeared the morning Elias Morton vanished. People fenced off Dead Row for good, posting signs warning of unsafe ground and unstable ruins, but the real reason was never written. Everyone knew. Decades blurred into the 20th century. Cars replaced wagons. Factories rose where forests once stood. Yet even then, travelers swore that when engines failed on that road, a voice beneath the wind asked them a question no one could answer. What does the earth owe the dead? No map carries the name Morton anymore. The mansion is gone, its foundations eaten by swamp grass and time. But locals say when lightning walks sidewise across a summer night, the fields turn briefly silver, and the silhouettes of workers appear again. Row after row, endless, their tools striking the same patient rhythm. Watching from the hill stands the shape of a man on one knee, head bent low, forever remembering the moment pride turned to soil. And each time the wind crosses that valley, it hums the same three words, the final song of the land that learned to speak. Bow low, master. By the 1950s, historians began documenting the plantation's history, interviewing the descendants of those who had survived it. They collected stories passed down through generations, tales of Isaac's defiance, of Morton's cruelty, of the curse that followed. One historian, a black woman named Dr. Eleanor Price, spent years researching the site. She uncovered records of the enslaved who had lived and died there, giving names to those who had been reduced to ledger entries and property numbers. In her final report, she wrote, "The Morton plantation stands as testament not to the power of masters, but to the endurance of those they tried to break." Isaac's story is not one of supernatural vengeance, but of the earth itself bearing witness. Every grain of soil remembers, every root carries memory, and when we walk upon land soaked in suffering, we walk upon the bones of those who refuse to be forgotten. The report was published in 1967. 6 months later, Dr. Price visited the site one final time. She stood beneath the crooked tree, now little more than a twisted stump, and placed her hand on the bark. Those with her said she closed her eyes and whispered something they couldn't hear. When she opened them again, tears streaked her face. "He's still here," she said softly. "They all are." She left a single white flower at the base of the tree and walked away. The flower was still there a week later, untouched by wind or weather, as fresh as the day it was placed. Today, the land where the Morton plantation once stood is protected as a historical site, though few visit. A small memorial marks the location of the slave quarters, bearing the names Dr. Price uncovered in her research. Among them, carved deeper than the rest, is a single name, Isaac. No last name, no dates, just Isaac. Because some names don't need decoration to carry weight. Some names, once spoken, echo forever. And on nights when the wind blows just right, when the world grows quiet enough to listen, you can still hear it. A sound rising from the earth itself, steady and patient. The voice of a man who refused to be silenced even in death. A voice that speaks for all those who were buried without names, without markers, without justice. The voice that reminds us, the ground remembers everything, and it never stops speaking. Bow low, master. Bow low. If this story has moved you, touched something deep within your soul, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to keep these forgotten histories alive, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every voice matters. Every story deserves to be remembered. Thank you for listening.